far too many years ago now to count. I was born in a suburb of Los Angeles, California, that had a great first class hospital overlooking the Pacific Ocean. I was lucky through accident of birth to be born in Los Angeles. However, now I've been lucky enough to travel halfway around the world and live in Canberra, Australia, over 12,000 kilometers away from my place of birth. Increasingly, more numbers of people have taken that step, either voluntarily or involuntarily, to move away from where they were born to try to seek out a new life in another state, in another country, on another continent, voluntarily or involuntarily. And so today I really want to focus on understanding why people move, what types of migrants are there according to international law and according to the readings we've covered today for this class. How have the nature of migrant patterns changed over time? What do they look like today? Some background statistics. Looking at a couple of different types of forced migration, international refugees, internally displaced people, and environmental migration, a relatively new topic that hasn't officially been codified in international law. And then we're going to look at the case study of Syria to look at how environmental factors led to internal migration, some external migration, and potentially to the civil war that is now in its 11th or 12th year right now. And so for today, I'm really interested in trying to connect and to try to better understand what world we are living in now in early 2022. How is it returning back to normal in the system that existed before the global pandemic? And what affects the kind of climate challenges and changes we've looked at over the last 5 weeks in this class, the economic factors that we've touched on in this class, and the myriad causes and consequences of civil conflict, how they all intersect in this week 6 of the class. We're almost halfway through. And so in this first section, this discussion is broken up into 7 parts, interspersed with different videos of different sources to try to give you a break from me. But for today, I think in trying to connect it to the kind of economic migrants that viewers in the developed world and students in my class would appreciate, people with dual citizenships are becoming more common as countries have come around increasingly to a willingness to accept people to have dual loyalties or dual citizenships. This map is from a recent project in the Netherlands, looking at the number of countries in different regions that allow double citizenship. The Americas are the highest with 91%. We in Oceania are just passing the Americas in 2000 with 93% of the countries allowing dual citizenship. Europe and then Africa and Asia below the world average. And so it's becoming increasingly common, and dramatically so since the end of the Cold War, to have people have citizenship rights and responsibilities in multiple countries. And we are living in an age of migration. The present and the past couple of years accepted. History is a story of migration, but we right now are witnessing an unprecedented time in the speed and the scale of human mobility. Recent statistics suggest that almost, now over this statistic was from 2015, over 250 million people are international migrants like myself. Over 750 million people are internal migrants within the country, connecting to our discussion last week about population trends that we've seen increased urbanization pattern in developed countries and developing countries, leaving rural areas, coming to urban centers. And we talked last week about the potential problems and opportunities that those flows to developing capital cities and major cities have. And most of these international migrants actually end up in 10 countries. Half of all migrants, slightly over half, go to 10 countries, including Australia, Canada, the US, France, Germany, Spain, UK, Russia in Europe, and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. So there's been, and we're going to look at this in a second, a tendency for migrants voluntarily to choose to live in certain countries. And we're going to delve into a bit later the reasons why that could be the case, the push factors and the pull factors and networking reasons for that. And 3 million people move to cities every week. Over the last 2 months now, we've talked about how environmental factors are making it more difficult for people to live in rural areas with less predictable climate and sources of income, more economic opportunities in urban areas. And so we've seen this huge flow of people to cities. Last week, we're focused more on voluntary economic migration in within states. Now we're going to look at forced migration through internally displaced people in other states. But also connecting it back, I mean, this is not a new phenomenon. We have been a species on the move with ever since we were on two legs. We've been migrating around the world. And before I realized the privacy implications of taking a 23andMe test, I saw where my genetic heritage indicates where my family came from. Surprise, surprise, most of it came from Northern Europe, which wasn't terribly surprising, but there were other elements of my genetic heritage that had come from other parts of the world. And you can see in this world map where you have these different haplogroups of people with different genetic heritages in particular areas, and you can trace where they've moved over time. So I think while we're talking right now about modern migrants and forced migrants over the last 10, 20 years, this is definitely something that stretches back before the dawn of history, of course, right? So in this lecture and in this week's discussion, I want to break up our discussion of migrants into three general types. The first is environmental migrants, those of us who vote with our feet to go look for greener pastures in other countries, as my ancestors did when they moved to North America. The second type of migrant is going to be involuntary migration due to conflict or fears of political persecution, through crossing international borders to become a refugee, or within borders for internally displaced people. And the third type would be environmental migrants. This will be one that's more directly interesting to students in my class, but that is also something that's reflecting a changing reality of climate and other structural patterns around the world. We talked a bit about how the early climate migrants have already occurred in Louisiana, where I used to live for a number of years, and how this is something that we're seeing both domestically as well as internationally, how environmental migration is going to be an increasingly important motivation and problem that domestic governments, international governments are going to have to deal with. And so I mentioned a little bit about my story. My first lecture question is to see if you have any links, direct or indirect, to these three forms of international migration: economic migration, forced migration, domestically or internationally, or environmental migration. If so, anything you care to share in Waddle for those students who are in my class, or in the comments below for those of you who are not in my class or don't want to bother going to Waddle. And if not, could you think of other ways that migration is affecting you in your own circumstances, either culturally, economically, or politically? This is, I think, this 5th or 6th time I've taught this class, and every year I hear and get to read some pretty amazing stories from students in my class, their families, or their histories themselves. And in discussion with a number of students in my class already this term, I know that we do have a number of people who have had in a much shorter lifespan than me, a really interesting and multi-continent journey to get here and watching these lectures. So pause, respond to that if you care to, and then we can dig in with a few more bits for this initial section for the types of migration. And so this shows migration to and from North America. There's a lot of statistics out there. I'm going to use a number of them in this class to try to provide context. And I know that a lot of students who take this class don't come from migrant politics backgrounds. You might have taken Kim Hyun's class and know a lot about refugees and probably a lot more in-depth readings than we have time for in this week. So I'd be interested to hear your take on my approach today. But given the number of people and the broad background in this class, I want to try to touch on trends so you know a bit about how the world is, theorize about how it got to be that way, and how the challenges that the international system and the countries within it are facing with migration problems. So those are the main motivations for me to try to describe the world, to try to theorize about how it got to be that way, and then get to the point that I know a lot of my students really enjoy, which is try to think about what might happen in the future or now. As I record this with the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion is now in its second month. There has been a huge, a multi-million flow of migrants across the border from Ukraine into neighboring states, including some reports of involuntary migration into Russia from eastern Ukraine. And so you have these contemporary problems related to international migration and potential future problems as climate pressures and political pressures might escalate in new or different parts of the world. How are we going to deal with it? Both us as individuals by voting with our feet, or by our political systems facing challenges as to who we accept into our countries, who do we let go, and how do we preference the needs of different types of migrants, voluntary or involuntary. And so in North America, the U.S. takes one of the largest amounts of economic migrants as well as refugees. You see migrant stocks to North America from different continents, most of them from Latin America and the Caribbean, and then Asia. You see a smaller group in Africa, though that's growing, and a very small sliver down at the bottom from Oceania. I've been to an Australian pub in Santa Monica. I need to get back there, see if it's still open after the pandemic. But Australians do tend to find themselves to Anglo-Saxon countries as well as further afield, though much fewer migrants come from North America and go to Australia. You see on the graph on the right that very small and slightly increasing amount of North Americans relocating to Oceania. Honestly, I don't have the statistic to see if they're mostly Americans or Canadians. In our department, we saw this deluge of Canadians, and now we're seeing more Americans. I honestly haven't seen in our department which one has more. But what we do see is quite dramatic network effects for economic migration from certain countries to different countries. And we're going to deal with this more in detail, but you do see the thicker lines going often within regions, but then also to those major countries that I mentioned earlier, like the United States, France, Germany, the UK. You see that line straight across the center from India to the UK, but then you also see large population going from India to the UAE. So when we think about migration, you can think about it in the different levels of analysis we've already talked about in this class, at the individual level, at the group level, the state level, and then the corridor, the sending state and the receiving state. And when people migrate, especially economic migrants, before I was able to pay off my student loans, I used to have to send money back every month. My family's lucky enough to not depend on my remittances. I know that a lot of other People that I know from developing countries as well as some developed countries do send money back to their families regularly. That is called remittances. And I did research on remittances in the past and their effect on civil conflict. And I think most people don't appreciate the size and scale of remittances. I think that's slowly changing, but there's dramatically higher levels of remittances being sent back by individual migrants to their families or for their own retirement or investment funds that drastically exceeds the kind of foreign aid that we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, and is on track to get quite close to foreign direct investment by corporations. And you can see where people are sending and receiving this money. Most of the countries sending the most remittances are those with the largest number of migrants earning money and sending it home, and those countries receiving it. You see a little jostling around, changing in the last 15 years with India, China, Mexico, Philippines, France, Egypt. They might change, but not quite dramatically year on year. And so you see an overall flow from disproportionately more developed countries to developing countries. And there's a whole literature on what effect that has on development and stability that I was lucky enough to be able to contribute a bit to. Now, I think it's clear as to the economic cost to sending remittances. You can see this graph here from the most recent quarter that I was able to get data for in 2021, that the cost to send 200 Australian dollars can cost anywhere from free to $18. I think the actual amount in practice is quite higher. I used to use Western Union and TransferWise to send money back to the U.S., and it was substantially more than that. And I think that's partly why people are excited about certain blockchains that specialize in sending money home, or with Bitcoin in El Salvador making it legal tender, because El Salvador is one of those countries that depends on remittances and trying to cut down the high fees that could be 15-20% of the amount that they send home. So economic migration has impacts in the destination country, in the country in which the people left from, and there's impacts of environmental and economic migration that you might not anticipate. So I wanted to kind of highlight some of those unanticipated effects, that with climate change, different regions are becoming suitable to grow different types of crops. And what seemed inconceivable 30 or 40 years ago, that you would be able to have decent wines coming from Canada, let alone the United Kingdom. I was there a while ago, and the early attempts were not very pretty, but I've heard they've gotten better. But that you see environmental, economic migrants like this French vintner moving to Canada and making wine, in part because of the environmental challenges that French wine growing regions have experienced in recent years. So this is a potential upside of economic and environmental migration. So there are a whole lot of ways of trying to understand the size and scope of it. And for me, I'm trying to make it real, both to myself and my brand new shiny passport, to kind of understand where I've come and the motivations that make people make decisions like me. And the Australian Bureau of Statistics has gathered data on where people are, and they really have a lot of great resources you can dig into if you want any time to try to see where people are born in your area, if you happen to live in Australia. And what you can see is a lot of neighborhoods around the ACT do have England as the most frequent source of migrants that have settled, usually along the periphery. That you do see certain areas that have China or India as the most common source. One neighborhood in Queanbeyan, maybe, that has Macedonia and Italy as the most common areas, but you do see clustering within them. So if you clear out all those Brits and Kiwis, you do see a lot more variation. Croatia, South Africa, the U.S. on the outskirts, as well as some in the inner north, and you do see that there's a lot of consistency, both with the global trends and where people are coming from and where they're going to, as well as local down to the Australian Capital Territory and just in the U.S. You see a lot saying the U.S., that was my home country. Now this is my new home country in Australia. You see a lot of consistency between the census in 1901 and that in 2006. And you see some countries have stayed at the top, like the UK is still number one for migrants' country of birth. New Zealand has become more common, bumped up to number 2. China has moved from 4 until 3. Italy has gone from 10th to 4th, while Germany has gone down from 3rd until 9th. So you do see some change, but by and large, there is a number of relative consistency. Now, I mentioned I saw a lot of Aussies around the world, and you can see that there's over 598,000 Australian migrants currently abroad as of the 2020 statistics. I'd be interested to see how many of those were actually able to make it back when the new census data. I don't know if the census has come out yet. I don't think so. But the takeaway is that some people move out of their developed country of choice, like me. Other people are moving to developed countries or between developed countries. And we're interested today to try to understand how the different motivations can overlap, economic, environmental, and political. So that kind of ends this initial video talking about the 3 main types of migration: economic, forced migration, either domestically in IDPs or internationally with refugees, and this new evolving category of environmental migration. And then we're going to see on how that connects to the causes of conflict that we've talked about so far in this class. Wanted to interrupt this with a couple of brief videos that I would encourage you to watch. One is the UN Secretary General celebrating World Refugee Day, which is June 20th, shortly after this class is over. A brief video on what an internally displaced person is. We'll be talking about that a bit later, but it's another way of trying to understand the unique challenges that IDPs face because they don't get the same humanitarian and international legal protections if they're still within the same state. And then 2 really visceral videos from the PBS NewsHour in the US, in which they sent a journalist to cross the Darien Gap between Colombia and Panama. There is a stretch of almost about 100 kilometers in which there aren't any roads, and you have these really tough stories and really compelling stories of individuals, not just from Latin America trying to move to the US or Canada, but migrants from sub-Saharan Africa, from the Middle East, that you have an image potentially of who migrants are and what different migrants look like in different regions. And I think these 2 videos looking at the Darien Gap provide a really great introduction to how a lot of these flows from a whole bunch of different areas can kind of coalesce as they try to move towards the same destination, and the challenges that migrants, whether economic or fleeing persecution, face when they try to go across borders. So let's take a break. I would encourage you to take a look at those, and then we'll come back and look at some further information about what migration looks like around the world in 2022. So let's go ahead and do that.